So let's turn, as we always do, say a little bit about some of the major economic events that characterize the last 30 days, the last month or so, and then some of the more substantial issues that either arose over the last period of time or became more intense and more urgent for us to look at. We usually start with relatively brief or short items and then move to the longer ones in the second half of what I do. So the biggest news item probably in the last month was the fact that the statistics for the first quarter of this year, January, February, and March, because the government keeps economic statistics usually by quarter. And the GDP, the gross output of goods and services in the United States in the first quarter, not only didn't grow quickly, it didn't grow slowly, and it didn't even stay the same. It shrank at a rate of about 1% a year. This was not supposed to happen. We are, as I'm sure you know if you pay attention to the media, in a recovery. And indeed, if you pay attention to the media, we've been in a recovery as far back as many of us can remember. The recovery is just wonderful and doesn't leave us. And so many people insist that we're still in a recovery. I notice major newspapers continue to talk about a recovery, which is remarkable after a quarter in which the economy shrank. That's an interesting definition of recovery, does not come from any dictionary I ever saw. What does it mean? Well, the Obama administration, which is embarrassed by this information, quickly put out a basic analysis, which is something that your grandfather or grandmother might have come up with too. It was the weather. It was really cold in large parts of America, so the story went, and people decided to stay home rather than go to the mall. And so they didn't buy stuff, and so the stores didn't sell stuff, and so they didn't reorder stuff from the factories where it's made, and so less stuff was produced. Okay? And we're all not supposed to worry, therefore, because the winter is over. You can see the sophistication of the analysis here. The winter is over, the spring is here, and everybody will go out and buy like there's no tomorrow, and we'll have a wonderful quarter in the spring to begin to offset the story of the first quarter. When you hear about how much an economy grows over a year, it's simply putting together 4 consecutive quarters. Some of you have asked me, well, does that mean we're in a recession? The technical definition used by the United States government for a recession is 2 consecutive quarters where the economy shrinks. So we are halfway through what might be a recession. If in the second quarter of 2014 the economy shrinks again, even ever so slightly, then we will have 2 consecutive quarters of shrinkage, and that will be officially designated as a recession. So I guess the best way to describe what we had is that we are in half a recession. And it will remain to be seen whether we experience the second half or another half. The next number that was widely distributed was the fact that our unemployment rate stayed the same at about 6.3%. And again, as I've done before, it's important, especially if one of the purposes of these meetings is to give you the wherewithal to talk with other people about the economy and teach others about it, it's important to remind you what that number means. The average level of unemployment in the United States before the crisis of 2007 hit, so basically the second half of 2006 and the first half of 2007, was in the neighborhood of 4.8%. Therefore, assuming you're up on your math, if we're at 6.3, we haven't recovered. Not even close. We went to 10%. We're now down to 6.3%, but we have quite a way to go to get to 4.8%, And that wasn't really good either, because that means 6, 7 million Americans without work. But that's what we had before the crisis hit, so we're not back. But that's only half the story, and it's not the important half. As you'll see this evening as we go through material, it's never adequate in economics to speak only, as is so often done, about the number of jobs. How many people have a job? As you've probably noticed in your own life, it matters not only whether you have a job, but what kind of job you have, and how much money, among other things, it generates for you. And here the situation is not a recovery, and not even close. The low-income jobs that were lost in the recession have been regained by many. But the middle and upper income jobs, not at all. What we've actually seen is a radical shift in which, for the majority of people who lost jobs since 2007, who are earning in middle or high levels of pay, have had to settle for jobs paying considerably less. And it's important that you understand that, because it'll help you explain why we don't have a recovery. Because even though we are hiring people, we're not paying them real well. We're not paying them what we used to pay them. And that means they're unable to borrow money the way they used to, because their incomes are lower and their jobs are more insecure. So they're not earning enough to go out and spend the way a recovery would require them to, and they can't borrow because they're already maxed out on the credit they can access. End result is no recovery for most people. So if you're feeling strange when you read about the recovery, feeling bad about yourself because your situation isn't recovery, then you should be comforted by what I've told you. You're the majority. The recovery is about a relatively small number of people, but you also ought to be angry, because if an economy isn't recovering, that's bad enough. But if it makes the majority of people feel really bad about themselves because they're not participating in a recovery they imagine is out there, you've actually made the problem worse. We don't have a recovery for the vast majority of Americans. They haven't recovered the lifestyle they once had. They haven't recovered the job, career opportunities they once had. They haven't even recovered the jobs they once held. And if they get a job, it is now without benefits, without security, with a whole lot of quality if they didn't want, and that they have lost, and that they continue to lose. In California, yesterday, a decision, also with enormous portent, decision by the California courts that basically says tenure for teachers is unconstitutional. You'll read about it tomorrow, or some of you may have seen it today. It's a very bizarre case because it was brought by people on the left who were angry about failures of the school system, and that was countered by the right saying, yes, there are these failures, and the tenure is the reason we have these failures. It's a little bit like saying, as we do in America, that our cities and towns don't have enough money to provide the services we all wanted and got used to. And everybody's saying, yeah, you see, it's the pensions for public employees. A magical move from a problem that we can clearly see to an explanation for that problem, which is highly doubtful and very controversial, but presented as if it were some kind of common sense. But you'd have to be blind not to see that if unemployment remains high, much higher than it was before this crisis hit, if the quality of jobs is going down the way I described, if we have assaults on things like the tenure for teachers, which is after all many decades old in this country, that there's a more general assault on this country's economic system. I've been trying to get that basic idea across for quite a while. I want to continue to do that. But these statistics need to be seen by you when I present them as parts of a larger picture, a bigger narrative. And then there was the fellow a couple weeks ago, and I don't remember who it was, who made an observation I thought captured brilliantly what is going on in the United States. We have hollowed out the middle, the vast array of decently paying jobs in manufacturing, in services, in the public sector that used to provide employment for folks and a decent living. You wouldn't become wealthy, but you would have security, you'd have a decent living, you could have children, you could live something like the so-called American dream. This is being taken away. Much of it's already been accomplished. A good bit more needs to happen, and it's all happening, unfortunately. And it means that we have the middle disappearing, making those at the top very rich because they get most of that wealth. They pull it away from the middle and plunging those in the middle back into the poor that they thought they had escaped from 1, 2, or 3 generations ago. But interestingly, and here's where the unemployment statistics come in so nicely, if you look at where the jobs have been created over the last 5 years, the recovery, they're mostly in retail sales. That's a polite way of saying Walmart. Fast food, McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, all of that. And temporary workers, people who work for those temp agencies, used to be called Kelly Girl and all that, right? These are jobs with no benefits. These are jobs that are relatively low paid. But there's an interesting dimension of these jobs. These are service jobs. Or to use the older term, they're servant jobs. We're becoming an economy in which we have 5% of the people that are so rich that the rest of us have to get by becoming their servants. The only difference is we're not Jeeves the butler who lives above the garage. We're not Mary the cook or Louise the child care person who live in a little shabby room up above. We have commercialized it. So we get capitalist delivery of child care services, of food services, of cleaning services. All the things that used to be done by servants living in the family or in the house are now done instead as commercial commodity. But the same bifurcation of the society into those rich enough to buy all these services, and then the rest of us looking for jobs, producing them. And again, no one, or very few, ask the basic question, if that's what we're doing, if we're having a very limp and lame and partial recovery that leaves millions unemployed and plunges millions more into jobs as more or less glorified servants, and not much glory in it, what does that do to a society? What does it do, for example, to the notion of education? You can see why we decimate our education system. Because after all, how logical is it to spend huge amounts of money training people to be greeters at Walmart, to flip a hamburger at McDonald's, etc.? And you can see this sort of builds on itself as a logic to hollow out a whole economy, and I would argue that the last month has been full of examples of that happening. However, I want to interrupt this because I can see from your faces that I have to attend to a criticism some of you made of me, well taken, that sometimes this presentation has a little bit of the air of the song you might sing at a funeral, and that I should, in one of your choice phrases, lighten up a bit, or introduce some more humor than I have managed. So here we go. Bear with me. One story caught my eye. I do not normally read the New York Post attractive as it is. But I do occasionally, particularly when someone hands me a free copy in the subway, when it makes it more attractive than it would otherwise be. And so on the 8th of June, 2 days ago, a story caught my eye from the New York Post. I'm going to read you the headline and then talk about it briefly. Developers are installing $3,000 smart toilets in new developments in New York City. The Sterling Mason in Tribeca, I assume that's a building somewhere in Tribeca. Can someone help me? The Sterling Mason? Okay. It's being renovated. It's an old industrial building. And it is going to feature smart toilets. I'm afraid this means that many of you have been relying on, I hate to tell you this, stupid toilets. And you should feel appropriately criticized. The Sterling Mason in Tribeca is outfitted with $3,000 Toto, that's the brand name, T-O-T-O, Toto smart toilets that play jazz and ocean sounds, comma, purify the air, and have ionized seats that repel bacteria. Now, what that says about exactly what you're delivering to the toilet when you arrive, that it has to combat this unfortunate result that you leave there, I won't go into since this is a polite place. This is a 32-unit building where a 5-bedroom condo is on the market currently for $9.65 million. So some of you that are interested, you could leave early and get to see it and sit there and test out the toilet if you like. The interior, I'm reading to you now from the promotional literature. The interiors were designed with an acute attention to detail and an uncompromising commitment to quality and craft, said interior designer Henry Ellis of the firm Gachot. Even something like the toilet, this is a quote, which is usually an afterthought on development projects, was a highly debated topic. These toilets have a programmable nightlight, remote control to flush it, and a retractable washlet to serve as a bidet. There's also a built-in deodorizer, a dryer, and a heated seat. Now, you may think our broad economy is in not good shape if you listen to me, but there are some bright spots. Okay, next item. Genuinely positive item. Last Thursday, there was a vote in the Rhode Island Senate. And in that vote, what was passed was that the state of Rhode Island will henceforth, I mean, if it passes the rest of the legislature, the Senate has passed it, the state will henceforth give preference on state contracts for anything the state buys to firms that pay their top executives less than 32 times the lowest worker pay. And that is the first time any legislature in the United States has ever passed any limit whatsoever on the ratio between the top pay and the low pay in a corporation. So in Rhode Island, the state, by the way, it's not forbidding it, it's just if you want to get a contract from the state, you will not be eligible if the distance between what you pay your top executive and what you pay your lowest paid worker is more than 32 times. Just to keep it in perspective, the average for CEOs in the United States of big corporations is between 250 and 300 times the lowest paid worker. So compared to that, Rhode Island is tough. Mondragon, a corporation in Spain I've talked to you about a few times, a co-op, the biggest and most successful worker co-op in the world right now. They have their own rule. They do not wait for the government to make a rule. They have an internal rule that they abide by, and that says, and they have abided by it for many years, the highest paid worker cannot get more than 8.5 times what the lowest paid worker gets. And that's what goes on in a workers' co-op, Rhode Island is trying to do it 32 times, and we live in a country that normally allows it to go much, much higher. Another item, and this is the lighter part of the evening, so hope you enjoy it. I want to tell you about Wall Street veteran Jay Dweck, D-W-E-C-K. He's the former chief stock market strategist for the banking giant Goldman Sachs. And he was in the news last week for spending $6 million to renovate his home 1 hour north of Manhattan. Some of you may have seen the stories because he brought the press in. The renovation features a swimming pool shaped like a violin with 440,000 hand-laid individual glass tiles and 5,600 fiber optic cables that light up like multicolored Stradivarius strings in time with the music he plays in the water. I can't comment on this. Finally, a story from England. England has a profession that's growing, which we have here in the United States too, called party planner. Those of you thinking about a career, finding certain other avenues closed to you, might think about becoming a party planner. Remember what I said about servants? Okay, party planner. The top party planner in London is Caroline Hurley. Her firm, Quintessentially Events, had chairs, at one recent event, they had the chairs upholstered 4 times to have the correct fabric by party time. Beverages, the cost of beverages at the party came to a little over £100,000 or $168,000. They're drinking well at the party. There weren't even that many people at it. And the entertainment, divers in a tank performing with live sharks while the guests enjoyed their cocktail. The children had a lion's head ice sculpture spouting caviar. What the children would likely do with the caviar, I leave to your imagination. But who cares? In a society polarized the way these capitalist societies are now polarized, these stories are easy for me to find and easy for you to find because they multiply all the time. A couple more short items. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler have decided to pledge $26 million. Ford and General Motors, $10 million each, and Chrysler, $6 million. Now, put it in perspective. $10 million for Ford is like 3, maybe 4 cents out of your pocket in terms of its relative relation to you as a bunch of your money. What is this for? And remember, I've talked to you about Detroit. Detroit is the city that has been devastated over the last 30 years, a kind of an emblem of what's happening in this society. Detroit back in 1960 had almost 2 million people. It now has 700,000. The majority of the people of Detroit being driven out of their homes, yanking their kids out of school, cutting all their relationships with their friends and their neighbors and their relatives, suffering financial losses as the houses they lived in had to be abandoned and they lost whatever money they had put in there to build up on their mortgage. I mean, devastating. And of course, the reason, real simple. The decision by Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler to move production of automobiles out of Detroit to places where they could get it done and pay workers much less money, which is why the cars are now produced in China, in Brazil, in Mexico, in Canada, and so on. These same companies who devastated have gotten together and they're going to give $26 million to preserve the art in the Museum of Detroit, because Detroit, being a bankrupt city, was seriously considering selling the paintings in the Detroit Art Museum to help cover the debts it has as a city that it can't pay and which it will not tax corporations or the rich, including these companies, to raise the money from. So they couldn't find it reasonable not to devastate the city, but they want to keep those paintings even if there's no one left to look at them. It's an amazing story summarizing what our culture has to say. Okay, let me turn then to some of the more substantive things, one that still has something positive in it. You will be happy to know that the number of millionaires in the world has gone up. We used to have, at the end of 2012, 13.7 million people who earned $1 million or more in 2012, around the world. This is the whole world. Across the year 2013, it went from 13.7 million to 16.3 million. These very wealthy people together dispose of many trillions of dollars. And they are the prime targets for most companies that produce consumer goods, because they're the ones who buy a lot and who buy expensive items. So a lot of records are kept of these people. So I thought you might be interested. Where is the wealth concentrated? Well, 152 trillion is the amount of money that these wealthy people have. 46 trillion, that's almost a third, are here in the United States, people with wealth here in the United States. But you might be surprised by the country that comes in number 2 for the sheer number of wealthy people that it has and the power they have in the world. The People's Republic of China is number 2 with 22 trillion, half of what the United States has in terms of purchasing power of the rich. And the next countries, Germany and Britain, are way behind, and they're really not interesting. And what's going on is, of course, a massive shift from producing for the market that used to be the overwhelmingly dominant one, the United States, to now a much more dispersed market of wealthy people with a lot to spend. And Asia is the place where it's growing fastest. China is the overwhelmingly dominant one, but India is developing a very wealthy, small group of people. And other countries like Singapore and Indonesia are following suit. So much so that in these statistics, this comes from Bloomberg Financial Service on June 10th, today, this all work being done by the Boston Consulting Group, is a famous gatherer of these sorts of data. They expect that the wealthy purchasing power group to go from 152 trillion to 200 trillion by 2018. So that's only 4 years from now. Half of that growth will be in Asia. And if you add then where the rest of it is, in Europe and Latin America, it means way less than half is going to happen here. So let me make that real simple. The explosive growth in the demand for goods and services, the profitable ones that you can sell at a good price, that's not here. That's there. Now, we know that corporations have been leaving the United States for decades now to move production to where they can pay workers a lot less. We just saw the example of the automobile industry. What you now need to get your head around is that there's a second reason corporations are leaving. Because not only is it cheaper and more profitable to produce elsewhere, it's becoming more profitable to sell elsewhere too. The United States is not the place you want to be. The United States is not the place that's growing. It's not the expanding market which every manufacturer, every producer wants to serve, because that's where the growth is, and that's therefore where your growing prosperity is. So American corporations, and indeed corporations around the world, are moving into Asia more than anywhere else to produce goods and services. That's why all of you are dressed in Chinese outfits today, one way or another. Right? But now we see corporations leaving for a second reason. That's where the markets are. And the consequences of this ramify in our lives. Let me just give you a sample of some of the ways. If you're going to spend money on an advertising program, you make shirts, or you make fancy watches, or whatever, you're not going to buy time in the United States because the market isn't growing here. It's more profitable and rational to spend your advertising budget in China, in India, in Asia, not here. Which means you need to engage a Japanese or an Indian or a Chinese advertising agency. And an American advertising agency, watching the business leave it and go to Shanghai, does what they have to do, which is merge with an outfit in Shanghai and move themselves into a position where they won't lose the business that's abandoning the United States. Let me drive that home. I'm going to use the word again. Abandoning the United States. Capitalism is abandoned. Capitalism is doing what it always does. It goes where the money is. You know people like that, don't you? Goes to where the money is. Capitalists are afraid of competition. One goes and the others have to go too, or else they'll be outcompeted. So they go. First they go to produce more cheaply and profitably by paying workers lower wages. Now they're going because that's where the market's growing. When a profitable corporation wants to endow a chair at a university, corporations love doing that. They give a bunch of money to the university, and suddenly you can become the McDonald hamburger professor of Greek literature at Vanderbilt University. Okay? It's good publicity for them. Well, are they doing that? Yes. But not at American universities. They're endowing chairs in Chinese universities because that's where they need to make the good impression. The United States is being abandoned. The reason I tell you the story about Detroit, or I could tell you about Cleveland, or I could tell you about Camden, New Jersey, or you could fill in, you all know these places too, is because they are the suggestion of where the society as a whole is going. Sure, there'll always be enclaves of wealth. New York City is a good bet. Scarsdale is a nice place, and so on. But for the mass of Americans, the capitalism of the last 300 years that built up the working classes in North America, Western Europe, and Japan, that used to concentrate all the production there, that gathered the wealth from the rest of the world and brought it to these Western capitals, or in the case of Japan, an Eastern. In the process, they decimated the so-called third world. They made the wages in Asia, Africa, and Latin America very low. They made the economic development there very poor. They created a mass of desperately poor people in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, while developing modern telecommunications and TV to make sure those desperately poor people had a good idea of what they were missing in Western Europe, North America, and Japan. So they were hungry for what they couldn't get where they were, which is why so many move and become immigrants. I don't know if you saw it last week, but it's a real crisis. The Italian Navy can't handle the tens of thousands of desperate folks from North and South Africa trying to get into Europe because their economies are so poor. But they won't have to much longer because the businesses are coming to them. They won't have to leave. The businesses are moving. Modern telecommunications, modern jet travel makes it possible for an enterprise located in London to do virtually everything elsewhere. So why not go to another part of the world? And they're going. And it leaves this powerful political question for the American working class, for the European working class. I'm going to be talking to you about that a little bit later. For the Japanese working class, it put a fundamental new political question on the map. Over the last 200 years, you Americans, you Europeans, you Japanese, over the last 100 to 200 years, you have been exploited, you've been ripped off in your jobs, but you have been given a slowly and fairly steadily rising standard of living. In fact, you were told, you were trained to believe that the only compensation for what happens to you on the job is what you can do when the job is over. Very interesting. You can't touch that job. That job is going to be run by the people who hire you. They're going to tell you what to do, how to do, where to do it, when to do it. You're going to be a beast of burden. You're going to be a drone. You're going to be nothing. But don't get angry. Don't be critical, because here's what we're going to give you. As soon as the job is over and you're out of here, we're giving you the money to go to the mall and buy stuff. It's very important. Consumption is your compensation for what you suffer on the job. And what you ought to think about, what is the oldest lesson of radicals, has been, why did you ever accept that deal? You can consume till you're blue in the face. You're still going to be insulted, humiliated, underdeveloped, abused on a job if you don't control the conditions of your work. Why didn't you demand that? Why didn't you say the compensation for being ripped off on the job is to stop being ripped off on the job? Rather than being told, go buy another pair of jeans at the store. Buy another appliance for which you have no room on the kitchen counter anyway, etc., etc. That's what it's been, but that's not what it is now. Because now, even that is taken away. The consumption isn't going up, it's going down. That's what this movement out, this abandoning of the United States. What will the American working class and the European working class and the Japanese working classes, how are they going to react when the capitalism that at least delivered them a rising standard of living while ripping them off on the job, now says that we're not only going to rip you off on the job, we're going to make you do with less for the rest of the day. Have a nice day and enjoy the happy hour when you're out of work, because we sure know what kind of adjective you'd use for the hours when you're working, if the hours when you're not working are the happy ones. And feel better because you can shop, or no, better now, feel better because you used to be able to shop. We've already been doing that, right? We are the generation that learned to go less often to Macy's and more often to TJ Maxx. So less often to a mom and pop restaurant where they actually give a damn about what they cook, and to go into plastic heaven at McDonald's and eat something where you can't distinguish the wrapper from whatever is inside the wrapper. Well, some of you can, but you have to go often to get that skill, right? Very interesting what we do as a society. Okay, I want to turn now, as I promised you, to some of the larger items that happen. And I want to do this around...
Before you turn to that, would you please include in what... I'm very puzzled about a piece of your thing. Not that I disagree with anything you have said, but what you haven't talked about is, my understanding is that right now, in the United States, 50% of the GDP is generated by finance. In other words, playing games of money. And you haven't included that in your description of what's happening. So could you include that before you move off this subject?
Sure. Over the last 30 or 40 years, as part of what I've been talking about, think to yourself, if business is moving, if the production of goods and services You know, 40 years ago, if I had asked you all to take off your shirt and look at the label on the back of the shirt, most of you would have seen an American city or state is where your shirt was made, or your shoes and stuff. Now you know that none of that's going to happen. So the production left. The production left. And increasingly, services are now leaving. I've given you stories in the past. I'll repeat one very briefly. A friend of mine who broke his leg skiing in New England was sent a ticket by his insurance company to India. And when he called up and said, "What are you sending me a ticket for? I want you to pay for my hospital so I can fix my leg." They said, "That's what we're doing. You're gonna be picked up by an ambulance at the New Delhi airport. You're going to be taken to a first-class hospital. You're going to be treated by a doctor who got his MD degree at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, just like somebody that you would see here. And you'll convalesce for a couple days and we'll fly you back. And that's how we'll take care of and we'll pay everything. Of course, you're free. If you don't want to do that, you're free to go and pay for somebody yourself. But that's what we're willing to do, and we can show you all the bona fides of this medical system. And if you want us to tell you why, it's very simple. The surgeon who performs the relevant task in New Delhi gets paid $28,000 a year and is wealthy. The American surgeon who would do that would be paid $300,000 a year at the minimum and feel himself poorly paid if that's all he got. And so it's really simple for us as an insurance company. We'll take care of you in India. And the doctors there read the same textbooks, go to the same universities, have the same exams, etc. They're just as capable. Indeed, some of you may have noticed there's quite a few Indian doctors here in the United States who have come here and gone through the stayed here. But the point is, they've found the ones who went back home to India, and that's how you get it done. So production leaves. Well, what does that leave here in the United States? Well, what's held on, besides all of the people who have become servants, we talked about that a half an hour ago, what's held on here are the tippity-top controls of all of these factories in China and in India. All the planning, all the decisions of how to grow this company, close that factory, move, all the financial operations, insuring the business, borrowing money for the business, all the finance, that's so far stayed here. There's no need for that to go there. All finance globally is handled by a click of a computer. You don't need to be somewhere else, and that allows them to concentrate. So we've had an explosion of the financial sector in the United States as the kind of flip side of the abandonment of the United States by the actual producers of goods and services. The other way that finance grew is also associated with all of this. As the United States working class finds its jobs disappearing, largely because they leave the country, but also because technology, the computer above all else, has wiped out lots of jobs, what have Americans discovered? That their wages don't go up anymore. There's so many extra people that the employer doesn't have to raise wages. There's loads of people eager to take your job if you get uppity about it. So he doesn't have to raise your pay, or he does it a teeny amount, and he makes a big to-do about it. So what happened to Americans was, for the last 30 years, their wages didn't go up, but they wanted to get that American dream. They promised their kids an education. They promised themselves a better life than they had in their parents' generation. Well, if you're going to give yourself the rising cost of a college education or the American dream, but your wages are not going up, what are you going to have to do? Borrow it. So Americans have started borrowing. So now everything is done with borrowing. Look, when I was in my 20s and 30s, when I went to go grocery shopping, I had to have money because no grocery store, and I'm not that old, right? No grocery store took a credit card. It was unheard of. You wanted to get your milk and potatoes and your bread, you had to have money. Many of you, find this prehistoric. You go into a local bodega, you get a plastic bottle full of water, and you hand them a card. The card is a credit. Suddenly, everything is mediated by credit. Well, who makes money? You think that that credit card is there for you to make your life happy? That's making somebody money. Otherwise, you wouldn't get it. The bank has its finger in everything. The bank gets a cut of the mortgage you pay for your home. The bank gets a cut of every credit card use you make. So as we become more of a debt-ridden society, we have to give more and more to the banks who run the credit hustles of this society. The government is in debt, banks make money. Corporations are in debt, banks make money. All of you are in debt, banks make money. Finance. Finance becomes the overwhelmingly dominant industry left in the United States. And it's a place that can still provide a whole bunch of people very high incomes. Even though the majority of people working in finance are not the ones you read about. They don't get a big bonus. They don't get no bonus at all. Go interview your average person from the Wall Street area. Not a happy story. So don't be fooled. There are some at the top, oh, they're doing great. But an awful lot of them aren't. There have been big layoffs in the financial industry the last few years as well. So it can only go so far. And the finance in the United States is constantly being looked at with envy and determination by the big banks elsewhere in the world. Don't like to see all that concentrated here in New York or London or Paris or Rome or Tokyo. They want to get their hands on the finance. They want to insure everybody. You will, and it won't be long, you will be getting in the mail advertisements to switch your credit card to a Chinese bank. Not yet, but soon. And they'll make you an offer you can't refuse. They'll beat the Americans, they'll beat the British, and so on. They're not going to let the United States monopolize that any more than they've not allowed the United States to monopolize anything. It's just a question of how and when this process continues. Okay. There was a conference. We're now switching to a bigger topic. There was a conference on the 27th of May in London, and I want to talk to you about this conference. It was called the Conference on Inclusive Capitalism. Think about that. The Conference on Inclusive. It was hosted by the Lord Mayor of London. Please, I'm just reporting. London doesn't have a mayor. London has a Lord Mayor. It makes him feel much bigger than if he were just a mayor. Okay? The Lord Mayor of London, in a very old British castle somewhere in London, they had a conference. And there were 4 keynote speakers. And before I tell you who they were, they also assembled, very proud, the heads of many of the largest corporations in the world. They said at the opening statement of the conference, and by the way, look up, if you're interested, Conference on Inclusive Capitalism. On the internet, you can find out much more information than I'm going to give you tonight. $32 trillion worth of assets were presided over by the collection of 30 or 40 top executives that gathered for this conference. The 4 keynote speakers, HRH, which stands for, I had to ask, His Royal Highness. See, we really miss out a lot by not being English. I mean, we just have a mayor. They have a Lord Mayor. We have a president. They have a Royal Highness. Okay? The Prince of Wales, that's how it's written in the program. The first speaker, His Royal Highness, HRH, the Prince of Wales. He probably has a name, but I don't know it, and they didn't bother to write it down. So that was the first. Second, William Jefferson Clinton, former President of the United States. Number 3, I forget his first name, last name is Carney. He's the head of the Bank of England in London. That's the equivalent of being the head of the Federal Reserve here in the United States. And the 4th speaker, was Christine Lagarde. She is the head of the International Monetary Fund. And she got, if you recall, she got that job when Dominique Strauss-Kahn did all kinds of things he shouldn't have got caught doing here in New York. He was, had that job and gave it up, and she got it. Those were the 4 keynote speakers. And here's what's interesting if you read, and as I say, you can get all this information, what they were concerned about. They were concerned about what they called, and please notice the language here because you can learn so much from the words people find useful and convenient with which to say what's on their mind. They were concerned about the serious side effects, their word, side effects of capitalism. And here's what they pointed to. A tiny number of people becoming extraordinarily wealthy while masses of people are not. This, they said, makes people feel excluded. From what? From, this is their choice of word, from capitalism. They use the word capitalism. They're saying we are presiding, ladies and gentlemen, over a system that makes an awful lot of people have very little money, and so they feel excluded. Now, here's what's really interesting. No effort to deny at all that capitalism is producing a lot of people with no money and lousy prospects who are becoming bitter and angry and depressed, etc. All of that's written down. They quote the things that some of us talk about in our work that I brought up to you here. That amazing statistic put out by Oxfam in England that the top, I forget the number, the top 185 richest people have as much money as the bottom 3.5 billion of our planet. You know, wild numbers. Numbers that show that the inequality being produced now really does rival back the old pharaohs of Egypt and Louis XIV in France and all of those things we used to think were inequalities of a system long gone. No, 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 we're doing that now. Or why that book that we talked about last month by Thomas Piketty, Capital in the 21st Century, is having such a hoop-de-doo and shaking people up and being the focus of so much discussion because that book tells us capitalism produces inequality. So these people are really worried that the side effect of this capitalism, side effect, not an intrinsic, a side effect. You know, you took the aspirin to get your headache fixed, but then you noticed that your left ear fell off. And you were concerned about the side effect. Okay, this is a way of making something that might be otherwise quite distressing, loss of an ear, into a side effect, which sounds like a minor irritation. But they're very serious. What they're really saying here is, we are calling this, they're very clear, by the way, we are calling this conference, we're gathering all you big shot executives together in this extravagant opulence where His Royal Highness and the former president are going to talk to you, and the head of the Bank of England and the head of the international, I mean the biggest big shots they could find, all gathered all day in London because they're really worried that people are going to turn, they say this, against the system. So I wanted to bring this to your attention because when folks like me say, as I do, that my experience as I move around the United States, and I do a lot of traveling now, a lot of speaking around, is precisely that I am noticing, if for no other reason than the number of people that pay money to come listen to me, which is strange. And something I'm not used to and never happened before a couple of years ago. When I say to people, I can see the turning away from this system. I like to find that I'm in the company of His Royal Highness and Bill Clinton, with whom I really thought I had nothing in common, personally or politically, that they understand it too. They understand it really clearly. And they're saying to one another, we have got to do, and they come up with a variety of suggestions. We've got to do something to make people feel more included. That's why it's called the Conference on Inclusive Capitalism. We have to fix this capitalism so that people feel more included. So I think maybe you might be surprised in the months ahead to see Bill Clinton come into wherever you work, say something really nice and warm with an Arkansas accent, and leave with the expectation that you will now feel included. Or maybe you won't. Maybe you'll be offended. I sure was reading about this. But it's a remarkable sign that even those at the top are beginning to recognize, more and more of them, that they're on a death trip. They're pushing what's tolerable to the mass of the people in these societies, and they keep pushing, and they stumble all over each other to push, and more of them are getting worried that they're going to push one step too far, and then there's going to be a kickback of stupefying proportions. Some of you also noticed that over the last month, rarely a day goes by when we don't pick up a newspaper and discover some strange folks amongst us who just took a gun and blew away half a dozen people at the local department store or in the post office or in the restaurant, you know. People that are clearly, you know, befuddled about all kinds of things, but they're blowing, you know, they can't stand it anymore. And what? Yeah, today, where was it today? Oregon, that's right. I saw some person shot at a school or something. School. Yeah, but I'm saying it's literally every day. It would be very naive not to understand that there are connections. I don't want to make it mechanical, but there are connections between a society being torn apart into these polarities of rich and poor, and folks finding their lives impossible to manage in that situation. Now, the second larger item that I think demands some attention. Over the last weekend, some of you I know from seeing your faces there, were at something called the Left Forum, which is the largest gathering of sort of left activists and academics that happens in the United States, and had about 4,500 people gathered at the John Jay School of Criminal Justice up on West 59th Street. And one of the featured guest speakers there was Kshama, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, Sawant, who you may have learned about or noticed a few months ago when she won, I guess back in November, the election for a seat on the City Council of Seattle, Washington. What was interesting about her campaign, there were several things, but the two that I think stuck out in my mind were first, that she ran against a long, successful incumbent liberal Democrat who had that seat. And she ran on the Socialist Party ticket. She didn't call herself a Democrat or a Republican. I believe the name of it is Socialist Alternative. But the word socialist is the word that people respond to. And she defeated this longtime Democrat by a significant, solid majority to become a socialist member of the City Council of Seattle. Now, this is not the first time a socialist has won such a job in this country. There are thousands of socialists did, if you know our history. But it's the first time in quite a while for a large, major American city. And the second thing that was interesting about her campaign was that she took a kind of daring stand at the time she did it, which is back last year. She said that she's in favor of the City Council of Seattle passing a law, it would be called an ordinance when a city does it, a city ordinance mandating that the minimum wage for any job in Seattle would be $15 per hour. This is at a time when then, as today, the federal minimum wage in this country, dictated by Washington, is $7.25 an hour. There are several states, Washington is among them, that have a higher minimum wage for the state than the federal government requires. But none of them comes close to $15 an hour. So this was a very advanced position. She came to the Left Forum, gave some talks at the Left Forum, but had to leave before the Left Forum was over. The Left Forum lasts through Sunday, but she had to leave Saturday night because she had been informed that the vote on the minimum wage in the City Council of Washington would take place Monday morning of last week. And I have to get the week straight. So a week ago Monday, a week ago yesterday. So she flew back Saturday night, was there in time, and it passed. So that Seattle now has passed a law that requires every employer in Seattle, present or future, must pay a minimum of $15 an hour. I believe at the time this was passed, the minimum wage in the state of Washington was around $9 an hour. So it's a major increase above what the state, let alone what the federal government. What then do we say about this? Well, I think there are enormous lessons here. First, that the American people, if given a chance, and the polls, by the way, show this. The Gallup poll shows clear majorities of Americans are in favor of raising the federal minimum wage from the present $7.25 an hour to $10.10 an hour, which has been the level endorsed now by Obama. So clearly, the polls all indicate that a solid majority, 60 to 70% of Americans, support raising the minimum wage. By the way, there's virtually no chance that the Congress will do this. The Republicans are against it, and a good number of Democrats will not vote for it. The major pressure to prevent it is huge corporations that hire workers at those low wages, led by Walmart, Target, McDonald's, you know the drill. They don't want this. Many other companies don't care because they pay wages well above that minimum anyway, so it's not going to affect them all that much. But those that are at or near the bottom, those are the ones that are fighting very, very hard. Retail, of course, and what are these? These are the places where jobs are being created. These are the jobs that more and more Americans have. But it's interesting that when given a chance, American workers who were inundated with publicity, both in Seattle and everywhere else, by those companies, saying to them, if we have to pay workers minimum wage, you're not going to get your Happy Meal for whatever the hell it is, $3, you're going to have to pay $5. You're not going to get your latte in the morning for $3.50, you're going to have to pay $6. Because we're going to pay, the corporation coming right back at you. If we have to pay those workers $15, we're going to get it out of you. Trying to therefore drive a wedge so that the people who don't want to pay more for their coffee or their Walmart underpants will now oppose giving those workers a minimum wage. It did not work. That's the interesting thing. It didn't work. And Sawant is on the city council. She's a dark, for those of you who haven't seen her, she's a socialist. She's a female. She's dark-skinned, and she has a name that doesn't sound American. That should do it for you, kill your political career before it starts, and it didn't. So think about the number of barriers, in a sense, she broke, the number of hurdles she was able to achieve. And by the way, I met her at the conference last weekend. She's a very quiet, self-contained, bit reserved woman. No huckstering, no political, dynamo. She's kind of quiet. I mean, I've never seen her out in the street campaigning. Maybe she's different, but in the one-to-one conversation, she had to win on the merits. She wasn't some dynamic personality with a flair or anything like that. I don't mean that as any criticism. It's describing what I saw. Second thing that's interesting about this. Many of the people who've gotten involved in this struggle for the $15 minimum wage, and by the way, there are now important movements in at least a dozen cities across the United States to do the same thing. Washington, D.C. has one, Philadelphia has one, there's several. So she has already achieved what she said was one of her goals, which was to stimulate and to be a model and to encourage people elsewhere in the country to begin to do it. So she's already achieved that in a remarkable degree in a short amount of time. But many of the people getting caught up in this is very interesting and shows you the complicated, the dialectic, the subtlety of what's happening in our country. If you remember what we talked about before, that the jobs being lost by people through this crisis were often middle income and upper income type jobs, jobs for which people were well educated, were trained, and so on. But they lost those jobs, and those jobs are not to be had ever again. They're gone forever. And those people are being pushed into low income service sector jobs. Guess what? A disproportionate number of the people rallying to the cause of Teshama Sawant and people like her are those people who've experienced personally being yanked out of a good job and forced now into a crappy job with no security and no benefit. In other words, they have, and this is very portentous for the United States, they have gone through an economic experience that has changed their politics and has made them begin to think and act in a politically sophisticated way. You have to work very hard to win an election in a big city. You have to mobilize a lot of people. You have to get out and keep track of who's going to vote for you, get them out to the polls, all the things that political machines do. That takes organization, it takes planning, it takes preparation, it takes a lot of people working in an organized way. The left in this country hasn't done that real well, I'm being as polite as I can, for a long time. But they did it there, and they showed what you can get if you do that. If you have a political party and it unifies lots of different people who don't necessarily agree with each other on everything, but they could agree that she would be a better candidate than that fellow, and that $15 an hour was something which these people could understand was the damn minimum they ought to be given, having lost those better jobs 3, 4, 5 years ago. Very interesting for what is happening here. The system that took away their jobs, the system that forced them to go down the economic ladder, is now beginning to wonder whether it may not have made a very bad mistake. Because these people are becoming the critics, the political opposition, and we haven't seen that in this country for quite a while. And they were willing to gather around a dark-skinned, foreign-born, female socialist. Whoa! And deliver the victory to her. So I think there's an enormous amount. Having said all this, do keep something in mind, okay? This is a bit critical, but in the most constructive and solidaristic sense I know how. A political demand for a higher minimum wage is a demand that people exploited on the job be paid more, have more compensation for what happens to them on the job is better than less. Give me $15 for that awful job you make me do, rather than 7 or 8 or 9 per hour. And I understand that. I would want that for myself. I would want it for anybody I care about, except I understand it. But what you are asking for is a better pay. You're not changing the basic situation of your life. And the only way I can get this across, and I work so hard at this in many situations, is by using a parallel. And the parallel I'm going to use is slavery. Take, for example, American slavery. Africans brought over here against their will, etc., forced to be slaves in the American South. Okay, this provoked an opposition among the slaves and among well-intentioned non-slaves. But the minute that happened, the movement, the critical movement against slavery, split into two parts. One part said, it's awful what happens to slaves. They are not fed properly. They are not clothed properly. They don't have a proper place to sleep. The parents are yanked away from the children. The families are separate. It's awful what happens to the slave. And we're going to fight that slaves get a better diet and get more clothing. And then there was another group that said to the first group, are you crazy? The problem isn't that the slave doesn't have enough to eat. The problem isn't that the slave doesn't have enough clothing or enough shelter. The problem is that he's a slave. If you give the slave a better deal, you remain in the position to take it away when you feel like it. You haven't transformed this person into a free person able to at least try to control his or her own life. You've left them in the subordinate position. And that's never enough. Of course we're in favor of feed the slave better, clothe the, of course. Just like I'm saying, of course we're in favor of a higher minimum wage. But is that the objective? Is it? Or is it finally to say to people, why the hell are you going to work every day, producing $50 worth of output and being paid $30 for doing it? And is your solution to be paid $35 for doing it? Or is the solution that you become the controller of the wealth you produce, together with the others that do it with you? That you become your own boss, your own operation. What are you being the slave? Karl Marx liked to call workers wage slaves. He didn't choose that kind of phrase by accident. He wanted people to see it's like a kind of slavery. When you go to work, you do what the other guy tells you. You work where he wants you to, with whatever machine he provides, on the raw material he tells you to, and at the end of the day, you go home like he tells you to, and you leave behind what you produced. You produced it, your brains, your muscles. You produced it, but you don't get it. He gets it, and you didn't produce it. You're the slave. So, yes, we want a movement to raise the minimum wage. But the problems of this society, like those of a slave society, have more to do with the very fact of what it means to be an employee than with how much money you get paid for being in that subordinate position. So you congratulate this movement, but you kind of also have to say, you got to go further. I'll go even a step further now. I don't think, and it kind of undoes what I said 5 minutes ago, I don't really think that many of the people who worked so hard for her and got her elected were really that much motivated by getting the extra money. Was it important? Sure it was. Were they right to fight for it? Absolutely. But here's my suspicion. They loved the battle because they weren't drones anymore. They weren't slaves. They were standing up and saying, no, we're going to play a role in shaping what goes on here. What got them motivated and exciting is we've become active, not passive. We're not the people who are told what to do. We're changing the way this game works. Watch us, because we're the majority, and if we hang together, whoa, what we can do. You thought it was crazy we're going to raise the minimum wage from $7.25 to $15. You can't do that. They did it. You'll never get people to support that. They did it. Very dangerous. Seattle is a very dangerous. In some ways, the quiet voting, this woman's thing, will have as big or bigger an effect than what happened some years ago in Seattle that many of you know about, that with a conflict with the police about the international meetings there and so on. Okay, next item. 27th of May was the Conference on Inclusive Capitalism. 2 or 3 weeks around that time, the peak explosion around the campaign for a $15 minimum wage in Seattle. And on May 25th, this last week of May was dynamite. There were elections in Europe, and those are important for Americans as well as for Europeans, indeed for the whole world. So I got to talk to you about that, even though the reporting here in the United States about these events would have to be described as somewhere between stupefyingly ignorant and horrible. And you can pick your whatever place in there, in that range you like. So I'm going to have to tell you about it because I can't assume that whatever you got in the way of mass media, unless you did some research on your own, it's not that it's difficult to find, but you'd have to do the work because what was presented was awful. Okay, so everyone in Europe was invited to vote. That is, everyone in Europe who's part of the European Union. That's not all European countries. I think it's 27 countries or whatever. Most of Europe is part of what is now called the European Union. And let me explain what that is. We still have the independent countries of Europe. There's still a France and a Germany and an Italy and a Sweden and all of that. And each of these societies has their own government, and they have elections to elect their own leaders, their congresses, their parliaments, and so on. However, they have defined themselves as a union. They are trying to become, and there's no reason not to use this word, the United States of Europe, as opposed to the United States of America. They're moving in that direction. So, for example, the 18 countries, if I kept my numbers correct, now have a common currency. The French don't use the French franc anymore, and the German don't use the Deutsche Mark, and the Italians don't use the lira. They all use the euro, E-U-R-O, right? They have a common currency. And they also have a common parliament. That is a government for the whole union that is separate from the governments of each of them. So in a sense, they're trying to become the federal government relative to the state governments like we have in 50 states and they have in whatever the number of countries are that they have. So the elections on the 25th of May were for the federal, the European Parliament. And people ran as candidates to go to Brussels, because it's in Brussels, Belgium, that the government of Europe sits. That's where they're physically located. So if you get elected in Portugal, then you go to Brussels to represent your part of Portugal that you get elected from. And it's also, of course, a test for the political popularity, both of the parties in each country, but also for the attitude of people about Europe, about the effort to unify Europe, etc. And again, just as background, if you take all of Europe together, it's a bigger population than the United States, and it's a bigger and richer economy than that of the United States. So as they get closer to unity, we in the United States have got a more and more formidable competitor. Maybe a competitor we can do business with, maybe a competitor who becomes an enemy. That's open, that's unclear. But you're not talking about a little economic unit. France is little relative to the United States. Germany is little, but put them together, no. They're bigger than the United States. Bigger in population, bigger in resources, bigger in total production. Okay? Wealth, all of that. Okay. So what happened? Very interesting. The Europeans went to the ballot. And first thing we discover is when they were asked, why did you vote the way you did? The overwhelming two issues were, one, the economy, and number two, the whole proposition of a unified Europe. Do you want a unified Europe? Do you not want a unified Europe? So, for example, right-wing political movements in Europe, and they have been growing. And in this election, two of them did spectacularly well. In France, something called the Front National, which means National Front, a party led by Marine Le Pen, whose father founded this party 20 or 30 years ago. It is an extreme right-wing party. One of its major political commitments is to basically eject non-French people from France. And France has millions and millions of non-French people, particularly from North and South Africa. The biggest group are Arab peoples from north of Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, all of that. But also a growing large presence of Southern African. You know, France once had a big empire in southern parts of Africa, Black Africa, and large numbers of those folks have also moved into France. And then a whole smattering of others. For example, there's a large Turkish population, a large Iranian population in France. So they're very anti-immigrant. They make this case that the French economy is hurting working class French people, by the way, for all the same reasons that American working class people are having problems, French companies leaving, all of that. But the right wing can't accuse the big businesses because they want the support of big business. So they never question capitalism, they never criticize capitalism. Again, you should notice this similarity with the right wing in this country, which is also extremely careful to celebrate big business and we're not critical of you at all. But in Europe, they go quite a ways and they denounce the immigrant. It's your fault. It gets to you bizarre question. A working class Frenchman screaming at a very poor Arab person from Morocco, blaming him for the French person's trouble. In most situations, this would be called a stretch. But it works because it's an allowable object of hate. It ties into racist and anti-Islamic, and you can see how nicely this works in the context of France. It worked like a charm. France has two traditional political parties. A right wing, there's actually two parties in France that compose the basic right wing. They had the previous President Sarkozy, some of you remember, and a left of center wing, which happens in France for historical reasons to be called the French Socialist Party, and they control the government now with Mr. Hollande, François Hollande, who's the president of France at this point. These are the two traditional parties. They came in second and third. The right-wing party came in first, got 25% of the vote, took the dominant. So France will be primarily represented in the European Parliament by extreme right-wing politicians whose basic thrust is we hate unified Europe because it dilutes the French culture. The French, the French are big into this sort of thing, and we want nothing to do with that. And above all, we want to get these non-white, non-Christian, blah, 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 out. And that'll make us a much better society. So that's really interesting. That is a rejection. The equivalent in this country would be if the Republicans and Democrats came in second and third, and I don't know, Ralph Nader came in first. Or maybe a few years ago, Jesse Jackson, something that would really shake up the notion of what politics was in this society. The French still haven't gotten over it. Every day it's a dominant story in the French press. Second example, in a quiet country. How many of you here have ever been to Denmark? Okay, so Denmark, I don't mean any disrespect. Denmark is about cheese and herring and lovely countrysides and the Tivoli Gardens and lovely things that they have in Denmark. But it's just not known for violent swings of any sort about anything. They voted for a right-wing politician this time, like the French. Amazing. And in Greece, country really decimated by this crisis, there were modest gains for a party that calls itself the Golden Dawn, and that is not content with advocating the ejection of immigrants. And Greece, like Italy, is an entryway for immigrants from all over Asia and Africa who can get into Greece, Greece is tremendous shorelines. It's easy to get on a boat and get into Greece, like it's easy to get on a boat and get into Italy. Between the rocky coast, between the rocky water, between the harbors, and between the innate, I'm trying to figure out a nice word, the innate ambivalence about the law of many public officials. You put all that together, it's easy to get into Europe. And now with a unified Europe, once you're in Greece or once you're in Italy, you can go anywhere in Europe. There are no more border controls because it's all now a unified area. So in Greece, there's a movement that is not only against the immigrants, but takes it one step further, which you haven't seen quite so much of yet elsewhere, which is they physically attack and on occasion kill immigrants on the streets of Athens, Piraeus, Saloniki, the other major cities in Greece. Very serious, very serious. So serious that at one point there was a public backlash and the government of Greece arrested most of the leaders of the Golden Dawn, and they're now in legal proceedings, and some of them will go to jail. Okay, so this happened, and it's clearly what? It's a sense that Europe is becoming, and I'm going to use language that some of you know from parts of the United States, that Europe is a terrible mongrelization. It is mixing people together that dilutes their innate purity. Some of you ought to get nervous with this language. It ought to remind you of things if I need to help you in that regard. They don't want this. They want Greece to be purely Greek, get rid of all the immigrants. And so they're against Europe. They said to their people, vote against Europe. Europe is plunging you into economic difficulty. Europe is bringing in all of these strange people, Muslims, not white, all that kind of thing. You have to move against it. So clearly that's the right wing's response, and they did very well in France, Denmark, and Greece particularly. And the American papers were full of it. And they were full of it as if all of the elections in Europe were right-wing victories. And I'm going to show you in a minute, that's completely wrong. And number two, that this had to do with a commitment to right-wing ideas. It didn't. It was a vote of protest against the economic difficulties these people face, which they were convinced had something to do with immigrants and with the attempt to have a unified Europe, so they don't want unified Europe and they don't want immigrants, because they think that's going to help their economic troubles. A little bit like the 1960s, when American workers were very, very upset about their economic difficulties and thought that a way to improve their situation would be to kill a hippie. And it took, I'm serious, and it took a lot of people a lot of time to persuade American workers, which they did, by the way, that killing a hippie would not significantly alter your difficulties. Just wouldn't. Do you really care if someone has a lot of hair on their face? Or wears a ponytail? Or has an earring? Or whatever the hell else were the symbols? It took a while, but it worked. So what happened in Europe was actually a protest. And here's why we know that that's the case. Because in other societies, the protest was clearly about economics and came either from the left or from the middle. Let's start with the left. The results in Greece. I picked Greece because there was a right-wing move. The right-wing party, I think, got 13%, which is a lot. But here's the most important thing of all. In the parliamentary election, the #1 position in Greece, never achieved by this party before, was achieved by the Syriza party. Syriza in Greece means Alliance of the Far Left. This is a party, a good number of whose members define their party as being based on the slogan, Greece can do better than capitalism. They came in first. Their representatives will represent Greece in the European Parliament, because that's what it means if you win. And they won by a significant amount over the combined vote of the two former major parties. So this is the equivalent of Ralph Nader getting more than the combined vote of the Republicans and Democrats. So the Syriza is now expected, if and when new elections are called in Greece, they have to happen in about 3 years, but the existing government can always dissolve itself and then there are new elections. That's how their system works. If Syriza gets its way, and it called immediately, the night of the results, it called to dissolve the government and have new elections. Why? Because they'll win. They now know that. If they win, it will be the first government in Europe in decades to be officially anti-capitalist. And the impact on the rest of Europe will be amazing. So this is extremely. Second, a group of people in Spain. Spain is the fourth biggest economy in Europe. Spain is a power. Spain is a big economy. You know, Germany, France, Italy, Spain. Those are the four big economies of Europe. In Spain, there was a movement like the Occupy Wall Street in the United States, but it was called the indignados, the indignant ones, the ones angry at everything that the politicians were all crooked. You know, a bunch of ideas which would go down real well here in the United States. They called themselves not Occupy Wall Street, obviously, they called themselves the indignados. 4 or 5 months ago, they decided that these parliamentary elections would be a good time to get them all together to make the transition from a social movement of criticism to a political party. In a sense, they were doing the same kind of thinking that Kshama Sawant did in her way in Seattle. And they formed a political party called, in Spanish, my apologies for those of you who don't speak Spanish, Podemos, which I believe means we can, which should sound familiar as a slogan. We can. It's kind of close to, yes, we can, right? So we can. And turns out they could. That's right. We can, they could, they did, they came in first. Whoa. Spain, a far left-wing thing, 4 months old, walked away with the election. I don't remember the exact numbers they got, but they came, I think, first or second. They shook up all of Italian politics, an extreme left-wing. So if you had two big right-wing experiences, France, or maybe three, France, Denmark, and Greece, you certainly had two big left-wing ones in Spain and in Greece. And then the proof of it all, Great Britain. Great Britain has two parties like we do. One is called the Conservative Party, that's like our Republicans, and one is called the Labour Party, that's like our Democrats. Okay? A little new party saying we British want to have nothing to do with Europe. Europe is again polluted, unsuccessful. That's why we're having trouble here in England, which is straight out nutty, but okay, that's what, well, it's a way of focusing people's upset and anger somewhere. And so this guy came along, not a conservative, not a Labour Party person, wins the election. A horrific embarrassment for Mr. Cameron, who's the Prime Minister in Britain, who couldn't get anybody to vote for his position. He's outflanked by this newcomer, who's, by the way, hard to describe. He's more right than left, but he's, you know, a unique kind of character. Basically says, if you hate the traditional politicians, vote for me. And that was enough for the British. That's it. You got me. I'm with you on that. I don't want to be told this and that detail. But here's the message for all of us, whether from the left or for the right. The common denominator that is now emerging across Europe is this. Capitalism, the system we've all had for decades, is becoming less and less tolerable. People are looking for any and every opportunity to basically say, no, I don't want this, I don't like this. interviews about people's attitudes towards Europe produced the same outcome. What emerged was people were angry at Europe, Europeans, very suspicious, because they had been sold a bill of goods they feel they had been betrayed. They were told that a unified Europe would make Europe a better place to be, a better place to work, a better place to raise your children, etc., than it had been. That all the working classes of Europe should get together and support a unified Europe because they'd be a lot better off than they were in their little countries. And the European working class supported unification. And they now feel betrayed. Their economies are in a disaster. Unemployment in France is 12%, twice what it is here. And that's typical all across Europe, except for Germany. By the way, in Germany, nothing changed. Everything's quiet in Germany. Because they're doing very well. For them, the problems of other parts of Europe are because of those inferior people. Which, if you think about German history, is a very dangerous way to let your brain go. But the Germans, who have their own problems, constantly congratulate themselves that they're not like the Italians or the Greeks or the Spanish or the Portuguese, and that's because they are, dare we say it, Aryans. Very dangerous stuff. Very dangerous game for the Germans to play. But the reality is, people weren't voting for the right or the left, much as I would wish they had. And I'm glad they voted for Syriza in Greece, because it really is a break for Europe. But what they were really voting for, just as I suspect Americans were voting in Seattle, was to say the existing system isn't working for most of us. We don't like it, we don't want it, and we'll look almost anywhere else to see if there's some shred of likelihood that going in that direction could get us something better than the constant deterioration we see all around us. And if that's true, if I've gotten it right, then what we're seeing in Europe is an even further development of what is likely to happen here. That what happened in Seattle is what is moving in those directions as people break from their traditional political loyalties, begin to look at new options because they want basic change. And I think not only does it look that way from the left, but the reason I presented you with the information about the London Conference on Inclusive Capitalism is because the people on the other side are beginning to see it too. And they're worried. And that's a very important thing for us, that they're worried. I'm not worried about what they can do. I'm much more interested in what they're willing to admit. And unlike all the big conservatives in the United States, who are still trying to deny that inequality is worse than it ever was, who are still trying to deny all of these things, these folks, they say at one point in their document, you know, denying all this stuff, it hasn't worked. They're admitting, if it had worked, they'd go with it. They'd go with it. No climate change, no inequality, nah, not happening. By the way, if you want to see the best example of denial, just read the Wall Street Journal. The editorial page of the Wall Street Journal is like a primer. It's a wonderful, 3 days is enough. 4 days you become ill. But 3 days is enough, and you will see there, there's sort of, no, Thomas Piketty, the Financial Times, Thomas Piketty made statistical mistakes. The #1 statistician in the world on this subject has been for 25 years. Everybody in the world uses his, including the Financial Times, and they're going to quarrel with an editorial writer on the newspaper finding trouble with this. It's childish. It's just childish. But denial didn't work. What the folks in London do understand is we got to go to a different tack, because denying these things isn't working. So now let's make an inclusive capitalism. If I can guess right, the next thing we'll begin to do is we'll begin to say, and these are old ideas that will be recirculated. millions of Americans own shares of stock. See, capitalism is helping everybody. And they just hope that you don't notice that, yes, millions of Americans do own shares of stock. Most of the millions of Americans own somewhere between 6 and 9 shares of something. Grandma gave it to them, you know, for their confirmation, or when they reached age 18 or something. And so they have them, and they're pretty sure they know how to spell the name of the company. But that's it. 1% of the shareholders own 75% of the shares. Never forget that. Then you'll understand that. But they'll try that because that is supposed to make us feel included by a system which for 40 years has specialized in pushing Americans out of the American dream, out of participation in everything that was promised. Bottom line, if some of the things I've said over today and in previous ones have gotten some of you down or depressed, that the information is troubling, please see also the flip side, which I've tried to stress a bit more tonight, which is big changes are underway, really big ones. Changes in the way people think about themselves, about the economic situation, jobs, or politics. People are abandoning the political parties they, their parents, and their grandparents voted for. Something is going on. No one quite knows how it'll play out, where it'll go. I don't either. But this is a time of momentous opening up and shifting. And the big question is, when and how will the working classes of the United States, of Europe, of Japan get their act together, form organizations, and thereby begin to wield the economic and political power that is potentially theirs, but only potentially until they act. And that's why Savant is important, and that's why Syriza in Greece is important, that's why Podemos in Spain is important. And representatives of all these organizations were at the Left Forum, and we're talking to people, so there's some cross-fertilization as people compare their situation. Last thing for today, then I'll stop. Privatization. Several of you have emailed me, asked you to talk about privatization. What is that? That's when a government takes an enterprise run by the government and turns it over to private owners who then run it as a private business. Okay? So privatization has been a big watchword of the last 30 years. And it is happening all over the world, in the United States and out. The reason it's been happening much of the time the last few years is very simple. Governments everywhere are strapped for money. Because millions of people are out of work, they don't pay taxes. They don't earn anything, they don't pay taxes. So the cities, the government, the businesses are cutting back, so they don't pay taxes the way they used to. So government, whether it be the city, the state, or the federal, hasn't got enough money coming in. So at that point, the cry goes up, hey, we can help the government. We're a private industry. Why don't you, the government, sell us whatever business you're doing, and that way we'll give you a bunch of money to buy that business from you, and you'll have the money you can't raise in taxes so that you won't be a politician voted out of office because you're not doing all the things we need the government to do. So everywhere governments are selling. I don't know if you're aware of it, but for example, in many American communities over the last 5 years, they have sold garbage collection. So that now your garbage, you may not even notice it, but the truck that comes by to collect your garbage is now a private enterprise, not the city public works department. Or they sell, well, basically schools are being sold. That's the charter school business. It's works a little different, but it's a parallel kind of thing. Hospitals are being divested and sold, privatization of hospitals everywhere. Around the world, one big scandal after another, water companies. Cities and states and governments, water is a right? We can't live without water, so water has always been something that a government makes sure is pure and clean, and the reservoirs and all of that, but that's increasingly been sold. Well, it turns out that the argument is that the private companies come in and they say, well, look, not only will we give you a bunch of money, that'll help you, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Governor, Mr. President. In Greece, by the way, I kid you not, there were serious discussions to sell the Parthenon. I don't know how many of you have ever been to, if you ever go to Athens, it's like the #1 tourist attraction. You go to this beautiful hill in the middle of the city, and there are these ancient Greek temples that have been restored, and they're really a magnificent, you know, what there was there. But, you know, it's like saying, well, let's see, we could sell the Washington Monument, or let's see, how about selling the Washington Bridge? And let some private company say that the toll will now be $842. If you want to see your relatives in New Jersey that bad, you pay, right? Otherwise, you know, you Skype them instead. It's cheaper. Well, it turns out the companies are taking advantage of two things. One, cities, states, and towns are desperate, so they can buy a company on the cheap. Instead of paying $400 million for the water system, they offer them $200 million. They're so grateful to have money because otherwise they're going to have to slash the teachers or raise taxes that people will vote them out of office, so they do it. But the second argument made by the privatization companies is that we can do the work more cheaply. Let us collect the garbage and it'll only cost X rather than Y dollars. Let us teach in the school. We won't pay teachers a union salary. We'll pay them something much lower, and that will translate in. So, of course, what is going on in the United States ties into what we began with tonight. You have privatization. You have the use of the crisis to take away from the public employment. Because in the public sector, people were typically paid decent salaries with decent benefits. They had a pension, they had a medical coverage, you know. So how many of you, like I grew up with this. People in my family were always talking about a job at the post office or a job at City Hall. It was not such good work, but look at the benefit package that your medical needs were taken care of. So it was that basic security that all that, when you privatize, all of that is gone. The reason the private company can offer to do things at a lower price, when they even do that, but the reason is they're not going to provide a pension, they're not going to provide medical care, they're not going to pay high wages. And so what you're doing is not only getting your garbage picked up by a private rather than a public, but you're surrounding yourself with people in economic difficulty. And to imagine that you're going to escape the consequences of that is just naive.